This is the Conscious Planet Network with your host, myself, Guyana Sophia. In these episodes, we'll be diving into inspirational stories of change, new technologies, and people really making a difference. There is just so much going on the planet right now that is helping to change humanity, our planet, and the future, and we need to know about it. So be sure to subscribe to the show so as not to miss any episodes. The Conscious Planet Network is an exploration of the evolution that is already in progress, one that you and I are a part of, that's happening on an individual and global level. There are so many people right now who are contributing to changing the tides of our future. Are you ready to be inspired? Today we have a big-time changemaker on our show. It's Elizabeth May, and she's an environmentalist, author, activist, and lawyer. She founded and served as the executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada from 1989 to 2006. And she's been named by the United Nations as one of the leading women environmentalists worldwide. Wow. Elizabeth is currently the leader of the Green Party of Canada. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think most importantly for Salt Spring listeners, of course, I've been your member of parliament for the last 8 years as the member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And we love you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I love you too.
Totally adore
you.
Thank
you.
Well, I'm wondering, when we think of politicians, we can be left, the regular person can be left with a sour taste in our mouths from the interrupted promises and lack of integrity that politicians can have. We all hope that our MP will walk their talk. When push comes to shove, it's always surprising when someone in politics is integral to their mission and promises. Now, Elizabeth, you're an incredibly bright star of a person with a heaping load of integrity, a heaping load. A woman who is willing to put it all on the line with getting arrested in the front line for protesting and resigning from positions when they're not aligned with environmental standards. Before we get into the amazing changes that you're getting to witness around you on the planet, I'd love to ask you, you've got yourself into a dinosaur system of politics, the old boys club, a system that seems to be broken from the inside out with hidden agendas and bribes. How hard is it to stay integral?
Oh, it's not hard at all. I'm not tempted to ever sacrifice my integrity for anything. What's hard is tolerating the abuse. And what's heartbreaking is that we have very little time to do what needs to be done, particularly in relating to the climate crisis. And it's hard to find the energy to keep going when you see people around you who should know better betraying what they should do. But I have no trouble at all in terms of preserving my own integrity. There's no risk.
Yeah, you've really got that ability, you've got that determination. Yeah. I think you see something much greater. Yeah. That's that our potential is, and you can, you're holding that really. It feels like you're holding that, really clearly for yourself.
Well, I mean, I'm not. I draw a distinction. I don't like. I know that I must be a politician. I'm in politics, but I don't like politics at all. And what I love is to be described as a parliamentarian. A parliamentarian is something that doesn't make people feel as though it's a derogatory term. Yeah. A politician is unfortunately, and we haven't had politicians in a long time who inspire us. It's been a long time since there's been someone in public life where Canadians feel, well, that person inspires me. It's really much more the case that it's breeding cynicism, that as you said, people betray their own promises more frequently than not. So it's almost a surprise when someone doesn't. Yeah. So I am very committed to having our democracy function at a higher level of integrity and honesty and ethics overall, so that the whole system enters into not, there's vicious circles and there's virtuous cycles, and we need to move towards the virtuous cycling.
It makes me feel as if you're actually making the system work.
I'm trying very hard. It won't work. I mean, obviously, we're in the middle, not the middle, we're near the end of an election campaign. The more Greens that get elected across Canada, the better chances we will have on a whole range of things, just because the old party's approach has been to let the backroom partisan hacks run what we do as elected members of parliament to an alarming degree. And that's where I know that the system can be fixed. It's not too late to essentially restore grassroots democracy into the Canadian political structure. But the pressures are against it, and the pressures come from the well-financed, well-organized back rooms of the other parties.
Yeah, which can be lots of bribes can go on. And
Well, I actually I think very little about it is about money. There is, I would, I think very, very, a vanishingly small percentage of people in politics accept money personally.
Really?
Yeah,
Because
really.
You see it on movies all the time.
Yeah, no, that's not what's happening. What happens is that people get elected to parliament, and then they're told by their party, whether it's Liberal, NDP, or Conservative, they're told, now, your job is to do what you're told. And you speak when you're told to speak. You say the words you're told to say. You vote the way you're told to vote. So that, of course, is a very soul-destroying experience. It's hard for people in other parties to keep going because, especially if they were idealistic and wanted to accomplish things themselves, they're immediately told that they don't have any agency and the party structure must be in charge. So the forces against grassroots democracy working well, and I see two different forces. One is the one I've been talking about, the backroom political party operatives actually running what happens in the House of Commons after an election's over. And the other is the excessive degree of power and influence that large transnational corporations have over our government. And neither of those things require changes in the law to get rid of them. Neither of those two things require massive transformations. They just require that people who are elected to higher office in Canada insist that we respect our parliamentary traditions and insist that we throw the large lobbyists, big oil, big pharma, whatever it is, that they're not allowed to start giving instructions as opposed to lobbying. They actually give instructions to people in the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office. So the SNC-Lavalin scandal really revealed a lot of that excessive influence of transnationals. And what's important about SNC-Lavalin, why I want to pursue it after the election and get an inquiry, is that it's not just about one corporation. It's about that group of large transnationals, whether it's, as I said, if it's big oil, big pharma, if it's big ag in terms of what happens in agriculture in Canada. Those industries are actually almost exempt from the regulations that bedevil small business. Small businesses don't get off the hook. Large corporations don't pay their fair share of taxes. Large corporations manage to evade regulations, walk away from environmental damage, only because politicians act as though they're beholden to them.
So something big needs to shift there.
Well, yeah. I mean, the system. I mean, I worked in government back in the 80s when it wasn't as bad as it is now. It wasn't bad at all. It was there were always questions of undue influence, but Parliament operated to deal with the issues that were facing Canadians. You never had the kind of complete overtaking of democratic impulse to find solutions for problems. All of that has been overtaken by, we have to win the next election. How do we craft a law in Parliament that creates an opportunity for us to basically turn it into a bumper sticker? So where there is no problem, but if the political spin doctors see the opportunity for a so-called wedge issue where they can motivate their base and depress the voting base for another party, they will pursue that in preference to something that actually matters. So just to make this real, I mean, in the Harper era, I opposed a bill called the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. Can you imagine? And it's still the law of the land. It hasn't been repealed. But when I was fighting it, I would say to the minister across the aisle, well, this is an abomination. This Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act is creating a piece of legislation where there is no problem. And the minister would pound his desk. It was Chris Alexander. Pound his desk and say, I can't believe the member for Astonished Gulf Islands doesn't think it's important to stop honor killings. I thought she cared about the rights of women and she won't stop honor killings. You have to say, excuse me, murder has been illegal in this country for a very long time. Mm-hmm. Naming them honor killings doesn't mean you have to have a different piece of legislation than the laws we have against murder or forced kidnapping and forced marriages. So the whole point of the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act was to stir up a xenophobic base within Canada that would think that somehow the Conservatives were speaking to an issue that the opposition parties were missing. At the time that we were doing that ridiculously stupid piece of legislation, we weren't responding to health care issues. We weren't responding to legitimate needs to overhaul our criminal justice system. We certainly weren't responding to the climate crisis. So that's what I mean. But the people who are actually controlling the laws we bring forward in Parliament are a class of political operative who never put their own names forward for office, but who, as backroom strategists, as soon as you win one election, your goal is win the next one. And in between, there aren't any public policy goals except hanging on to power. So that is far more corrupting than the idea that one or two politicians might take money. I mean, over the course of the career of people who become prime minister, they seem to amass wealth. But the average MP isn't accepting money. They're just in a system that is wholly disempowering because they've signed up for you won because you're our color. Now you'll vote the way we tell you to vote.
I think that's what people are feeling. Like they're just feeling like that, there's a corrupt system. It's like broken, and so it's just, there's a lot of judgment around politicians. So I love that you take on a different viewpoint of your title.
Yes, well, I feel as a parliamentarian. A parliamentarian means I'm a member of Parliament and I take the job seriously. And all Green members of Parliament are parliamentarians first. Being a politician is winning the next election. To us, isn't critical. What's critical is that at the end of this election, we're able to bring in meaningful climate action. This election is critical. That's why we need as many Green MPs as possible, because it's likely to be like 99% it's going to be a minority parliament. And in that context, we need Green MPs to work across party lines to make sure we actually address the climate emergency.
Excellent. Excellent. Yay.
Thanks.
So I want to bring this into the changes that you have made for yourself or made for Canada, the ones that you feel like are some of your greatest accomplishments. And I'd love to know which ones you feel are the strong, like what is big for you there?
Well, looking at two ways, I have a very, very, very long list of accomplishments. But second, it's always in the context of the one that really matters we haven't addressed. So until we address the climate emergency and actually adopt a plan to go off fossil fuels as soon as possible, the fact of other accomplishments pales in comparison. But
of course,
but just one example, like when I became elected, CBC was doing a survey and they said, we want to know if you'll agree to have all of your expenses and receipts put online. And I said, well, we were already doing that in my office anyway, so we'll do that, because it wasn't at that point required that individual members of parliaments and their expenses should be accessible to the public. It was very interesting. CBC then got back to us a couple of weeks later and said, we're not doing the project. We couldn't find a single other member of Parliament who would do it. I said, that's okay. We're doing it anyway. So we started publishing all of my expenses, from the invoice for the lady who cleans the office in Sydney to renting a town hall. Every single expense was itemized and available on our website. It didn't take long after that for the House of Commons rules to change. And all the receipts and all the expenses of all MPs are now available online.
That's so great.
Well, but someone has to go first. So, but that's a relatively small thing. I'm really pleased. I've gotten 2 bills passed as an individual member of Parliament. One, a national strategy on Lyme disease, which is still not properly implemented, and people with Lyme disease are not getting the help they need. But we took it a fair distance and we got $8 million for research in Lyme disease. The second bill is one to end the practice of keeping whales and dolphins and porpoises in captivity. So it bans keeping cetaceans in captivity. Yeah, it was a tough one. It took many years. Started in the Senate with my colleague, Senator Wilfred Moore. And from the very beginning, he wanted to start it in the Senate and then I would take it over in the House. And we managed to get it through and get it to become law before this election. So, having crafting laws is a pretty big thing. But I have to say, probably it's been more significant to keep raising the issue. Now, the other parties talk about climate. Unfortunately, they don't understand it, and they think that they're completely inadequate incremental measures. Particularly the Liberals think it's a really big deal because look how bad the Conservatives are. And I say, look, that's not the measurement. The measurement isn't, are you better than the Conservatives? The only measurement that matters is, are you doing enough to ensure that we preserve a livable world? Because the window of opportunity on a 1.5 degree level of global warming and no more will close before the next federal election in 2023. So we have a very short period of time to make a really huge difference.
I was wondering also, there's like a lot of, I know that there's a lot of things that are going on that, we need to put our attention on that are really important now, and one is climate change. Also, part of this broadcast here is like to bring people up, because it's been, there's such a bombardment of things that are like intense, right?
Yes.
And so, and what I know about you is that you've got an amazing, you've got your thumb on the pulse of the nation and also globally, I believe, when it comes to environmental things. And I was wondering if there's any things that we're not getting the news on, any things that are, happening out there on the planet that you can see that are great.
Canadians get very little news about Canada or the world in a way that I think is meaningful. It's really been sad during this election, particularly, that we haven't actually had a proper discussion of what the Paris target is and what the other parties' targets are and how we're going to get there. But I think we continually, and of course a lot of this happened in the Harper years to try to reduce the amount of actual information Canadians get. We hear very little about new records being broken in terms of how many solar panels can be installed in one day. Mexico currently holds the record. It's something like 2,200 football fields worth of solar panels installed in one day.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, or that India has already passed a law to ban the internal combustion engine by 2022.
Wow.
Or that Scotland is far, our Kyoto goal was to reduce our emissions by 6% against 1990 levels and do it by 2012. Well, Canada's still way above our 1990 levels, but almost every other country that ratified Kyoto more than achieved the goal. So bearing in mind that we're way above 1990 levels now, it's quite encouraging to know that Scotland is 40% below 1990 levels and hitting its target a few years ahead of schedule.
Sorry, 1990 levels?
1990.
That was the year?
That was the year.
Okay.
1990 was the base year for all the climate negotiations until Stephen Harper sabotaged our climate process globally by having Canada move to a 2006 target year and then to a 2005 target year. Right. So playing around with the base year was a very clever form of sabotage. Most countries around the world used 1990 because the negotiations for a climate treaty started in 1990. And so our Kyoto target was as against 1990 levels. The benefit of having one base year is that the goals become comparable. But we have a whole set of commitments that are apples and oranges because we have some countries saying, well, it's against a 2010 level or it's against a 2005 level. Suffice to say that in 1990, we knew we had to reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases. We had to move off fossil fuels, and we had to plant a lot of forests and preserve forests, and we had to do it fast. We knew that in 1990, and we didn't do it. So now we're talking about reducing, the Harper target, which Trudeau kept, is reducing 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, which constitutes finally getting a bit below 1990 levels, whereas Europe's already at 25, in some countries 30, and in the case of Scotland, 40% below 1990 levels. They're already there. Sweden's already committed to going off oil Sweden, I think, was the first country to commit to going off oil by 2050.
They would, though.
Yeah.
That's Sweden.
Well, Sweden, Denmark, France, the countries, New Zealand just committed to carbon neutrality, and they have a plan to get there. We're an outlier in the industrialized world in that we're doing so little. But when you look around the world for stories of inspiration, I think there's nothing as inspiring as Greta Thunberg and the ability of one little girl who decided to skip school on Friday and start a climate strike. Yeah, and she's motivated. We had this last month, from September 20th to September 27th, we had probably, if you take all the days and all the protests, close to 10 million people globally taking action on the same issue at the same time. Certainly on September 27th, when I was walking with 500,000 people in Montreal, at that time, on one day, we had over 7 million people demanding climate action. So that's encouraging.
So amazing.
Yeah. But it's obviously, it's inspiring because it demands action. It becomes a very happy story when we can look back and say, yeah, that was the moment when governments around the world changed the way they've been doing things, and we got countries to really live up to their promises to move away from fossil fuels rapidly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I heard you walked with her as well. Is that right?
Well, I didn't get to meet her because it was such a diffuse crowd, 500,000 people in Montreal.
Wow.
And I also didn't want to bug her. I mean, my gosh, that young woman is extraordinary. And as we know, she's Asperger's and on the spectrum, and everyone wants to get a piece of her. I'm very, very grateful for her leadership. But it's important to march in solidarity. You don't need to. I mean, we met with Justin Trudeau and said, "You're not doing enough." Well, you're not kidding. He's bought a pipeline. He's moving in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, the NDP claim to have a policy that's close to ours, but they don't have a target that comes near 1.5 degrees. So it's good intentions and nice words, but the bottom line has to be, have we got a plan that actually lives up to the demands that the scientists have set out, having spent a couple of years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change worked to answer the question, can we still hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase and not go above that? And they found that we could, although I know many scientists who think they were over-optimistic, but we have to hang on to hope, and we have to do the work that's required. So I find it always incredibly encouraging when we have more and more communities installing solar, and more communities looking to wind power, and more transition away from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, and to installing electric chargers, and planting local food, and planting gardens, and planting trees. There's a huge agenda here with lots of scope for every single Canadian to play a positive role in the project of saving ourselves.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we can do. We can just start locally, start in our own homes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Solar power, wind power.
Yes.
Grow some vegetables.
And also be more politically active, because all the personal actions in the world don't save us, but personal actions compounded through a real demand that governments step up and play their proper role, then we get to avert disaster. And we also have the benefit of all the things we've done in community together that build on each other, that support each other, and that lead citizens to recognize that we all have power, we have agency. We're not helpless bystanders in what's going on. We have a role to play.
Yeah, well, for our listeners, vote green.
Well, it's a big part of what's going to happen to get us out of the mess we're in.
Totally. Just listening to you, it's so important because you're so clear and you're willing to go into the places and talk about them. It's like, it's not, sidelining, and
Well, I just think Salt Spring
you're
Island,
a real leader.
Well, thanks. But I'll tell you what I really want to do, if we have enough green seats, I'm going to ask that before and if I were Prime Minister, I would do this without having to ask, convene Parliament without going to the first step of electing a Speaker. So this is because I don't want Parliament to actually get started till we've had a major crash course in education on climate science. So in my head is this vision of, if you're not convening Parliament, and I know this sounds really arcane, if the mace isn't in place, if you're not there as the House of Commons meeting as Parliament, you can actually meet as the Committee of the Whole, and all MPs can be present, and then you can bring experts in, because the rules around Parliament are nobody can be in Parliament if they're not an elected member of Parliament. But when you convert to Committee of the Whole, you can bring in experts. And I would convert Parliament into a classroom and have every question answered by every MP, no matter how completely unaware of climate science they are, meet until every question's been answered. And then Canadians would be watching on television. The media would be getting educated at the same time. And then we could go forward with a shared purpose, which is to figure out how to work together. And we're calling for the equivalent of a war cabinet, such that Winston Churchill had in the Second World War and Mackenzie King had. We can call it a survival cabinet. We don't need to use military language. But we need to really reject the status quo decision-making measures, because they will inevitably lead to protecting the status quo instead of making revolutionary change.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
I love that idea.
Thank you.
So one last question for you, Elizabeth, is in your opinion, how is this environmental emergency turning us all into global citizens?
Well, we can't solve it without everybody together, right? And that's one of the things, again, Canadians are very rarely told how much other countries are doing. That China has put hundreds of billions of dollars into renewable energy. Obviously,
Amazing.
China's still a big problem, but the Chinese leadership understands climate as a security threat. And I'm not a fan of Chinese leadership. It's a dictatorship that ignores human rights for the Uyghur people, for the oppressed, occupied Tibetans. At the same time, China has massive economic capacity and brilliant scientists. The People's Republic of China and their government understand that if what some people call the third pole, which is the Tibetan plateau and its huge amount of ice, if we lose the Tibetan plateau, or some people call it the third pole, North Pole, South Pole, and Tibetan plateau, 5 major rivers of Asia would dry up. For the People's Republic of China, with billions of people in the population, losing rivers will mean political instability, and it will become an ungovernable country. So every country is motivated for its own reasons, but Canadians, we tend to think, because neoliberal politicians who don't want us to do anything are very interested in telling us, well, we could do this one little thing, but it won't make any difference because the rest of the world is so awful. At which point you have to say to them, well, what do you think happens if no one acts on this crisis? You think we're all okay and we can keep making money? Because there's, if the global climate system begins to deteriorate faster than it is right now, countries become ungovernable. So the need to pull together, work together, and recognize that this is one world. No country is going to escape any more than one province. I wonder what's wrong with, wondering what's wrong with Jason Kenney is a long question, but to think that you can somehow be immune to the impacts of climate disaster because you choose not to think about it, or because you choose to believe that your fossil fuel industry is more important than your own children's future. These are choices we make, and we don't need to make them. So when I look around the world, there's a lot of leadership happening. There's a lot of inspiration happening. There's Greta Thunberg. There's the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. There are world leaders, Jacinda Ardern and my colleagues in New Zealand, who are propping up that Labour government in New Zealand. James Shaw is the Minister of Climate for New Zealand. And they're bringing in the law that says by every increment of years, this is the target, and by legislation, we must hold to it. Well, that's what we need in Canada. So there's examples from around the world in terms of policy, in terms of technology. We just have to start getting busy and taking every idea that's worked anywhere else in the world and implement it here.
I love that idea.
Thank you.
I love that you're the one who's doing this too.
Well, I wish I had honestly thought that by this point in the election campaign, at least the Liberals and the NDP would have changed their targets to meet what's required by science. I have to say it's been discouraging to discover that they were prepared to think that they could fool Canadian voters without a real plan, but using nice words and being able to say we're better than the Conservatives, they could keep getting votes. So that's, but I am very committed, and so are all our candidates, like Rochelle Coy in Victoria, and David Murner in Esquimalt Saanich-Sooke, and Paul Manley and Nanaimo Ladysmith, and Lydia Whitsom, who's the former chief of the Cowichan Nation. I mean, we have extraordinary people running right across the country, all the way to Greg Malone in Newfoundland, founder of Codco, God love him, running in Avalon. We have amazing candidates, and we'll make a big difference after this election, as long as people don't get scared off of voting green.
Yeah, well, that's it. But there's nothing to lose at this point.
No, that's right. We got to vote for what you want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's important. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. But after the election, we'll have to sit down again and touch base and see how it's going.
Oh, totally. I love that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I hope this show inspires you to walk to the beat of your own drum. May the stories shared here today inspire us all to see a greater vision of what's possible for our collective future. Want to hear more of these shows? You can find this podcast, The Conscious Planet Network, on any podcast search engine, including iTunes or Podbean. Or listen live on your computer every Friday morning at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time by Googling islandsradio.com. You can find out more about me, Guyana, at GuyanaSophia.com. That's spelled GaianaSophia.com. If you know of a special someone who would love this program, then be sure to send it along to them. Thanks for listening to the Conscious Planet Network, broadcasting to you from the Gulf Island Community Radio. See you next time.